Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to Whirinaki Whare Taonga. I want to first of all acknowledge the Mayor Wayne Guppy, who we have here today, also our Councillor Lambert. I understand he's around. Welcome, great to see you. Our exceptional guests that we have in front of us today, and we have with us our guest speakers, David Lowe, welcome. We have our Councillor Sophie Hanford, welcome along. And also Professor James Greenwick. Please give them a round of applause. I also want to just acknowledge the audience that we have here today. Thank you for following your social distancing. Now listen, just a couple of really quick things. In case there is an emergency, we have some great staff on board here. We have Georgie, who's over here, and also Mike at the top. And so if there is an emergency, just follow them. What we'll do is we'll just gather out the front. If you do need to use the toilets, you'll see them down there. You can just ask about the reception and then you can right there too. Well, my name is Rob Thomas. I'm the Strategic Policy Manager at Hutt City Council. And it is absolutely my delight to be on the stage with some exceptional people that live in our community doing some great stuff for issues around climate change. But before we get underway, I just wanted to ask you, who here has seen the Meltdown exhibition already downstairs? Fantastic, fantastic. Well, before you do go down, leave today, I do encourage you to go down and have a look at it. And also tell all your friends and family to come. So the Meltdown exhibition, which has been put on here, is a visual view around climate change. It's a narrative of the importance of the world's glaciers, the impact of climate change and their fate. And through the prisms of art, photography and film, they've looked at the relevant continents on the planet. And from over 10 international artists, the exhibition leads the viewer on a scientific, illustrative and poetic journey of climate change and its consequences. The exhibition is created and toured by Project Pressure, proudly supported by the Embassy of the United States, Hutt Mana Trust, Upper Hutt City Council and the Lion Foundation. So I would encourage you to go down and have a look. It's quite exceptional. For those who haven't seen it, please don't ruin the ending. I wonder what the ending will be. I guess that's what we're going to be talking about here today as well. So welcome along, and what we're going to be doing, today's format is that I'll be introducing each of the guest speakers, and they're going to talk just very briefly, do an introduction, and then we have a range of questions we're going to ask, particularly around climate change. And I know that you'll have burning questions, and really keen to get your questions for the crowd, for our speakers here as well. So we're going to have a roaming mic, and over here we've got Georgie, and she's going to take that mic around. So if you do have questions, please put your hand up a bit later on, and she'll be able to get that mic for you. So the first speaker today we have is Dave Lowe. And Dave is New Zealand's atmospheric scientist who is instrumental in setting up the Bering Head atmospheric CO2 program in 1972. Dave, I wasn't even born in 1972. And I'm a councillor, I don't think you were born either. And he is considered somewhat of a legend in the atmospheric science, being one of the first people to find proof that humans were driving global warming by measuring CO2. And he did that at the age of 23. We had a coffee catch up just before, and he was saying how absolutely freezing it was standing up on the edge there, and the hard work it was to try and capture those CO2 emissions in huge winds, gale force winds. So he established the world's second consistent record of atmospheric carbon, an unbelievable piece of mathematic proof that human activity was having an irreversible impact on the planet. And the work that he contributed towards, and also the same with the work that James did, led to the Panel of Climate Change IPCC report, and that report was recognised for a Nobel Peace Prize. That's absolutely exceptional. David has worked for 50 years fighting global warming. He is an adjudicator professor at atmospheric chemistry at the Antarctic Research Centre, Victoria University of Wellington, and was awarded by our Mayor Wayne Guppy the Wellingtonian of the Year of Environment category last year. And it was announced that this week that his book, The Alarmist, has been shortlisted by the judges of the 2022 Non-Fiction New Zealand Book Awards. Can I please introduce you to David Lowe?
Thanks very much for that very nice introduction. It's just great to be here. Congratulations to Hutt City for hosting this. We've all been out and had a look, and it's. I was just talking to James. I just have a mix of emotions when you see what's going on. Human beings, we're facing multiple existential threats. The war in Ukraine, pandemics, and on top of that, climate change. And it's kind of difficult to think, how do you cope with that? So personally, for me, as Rob said, I was a kid, 23 years old, when I discovered this horror in New Zealand. The first measurements in the mid-latitudes of the southern hemisphere showing the irrefutable rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I've lived with that horror ever since. I've tried to talk to politicians, to bureaucrats. I've published countless scientific papers, and the horror goes on. What do you do, as a scientist? And I know James feels the same way. What can you do? So 15 years ago, I quit a very good job at Niwa to take the extraordinary step of becoming an independent scientist, forming a small family company with my wife and son, which was focused on science education, and it turned out to be a very good decision. So since forming that company, I've really been able to get out and talk to people without worrying about what my employer might think of me. As Rob mentioned, last year I published a book. That book really is very, very different to scientific publications. It's a bunch of stories, and when I say we, myself and several other scientists, have now discovered it's pointless publishing more papers on climate change. They're not going to do anything. So we've got out there and we're using stories. And so the book is a bunch of stories which are aimed at introducing the general reader to the urgency of reducing carbon emissions. That's what we all have to do, and when we talk today, I guess all of us, Sophie, James and I, will be addressing how we do that. So that's enough from me, Rob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that introduction. And I understand you're also you're selling your book. Where can you buy your book from?
Well, I'm not a bookseller. Any bookshop.
Fantastic.
Or online.
Good, and good luck with that award. Our next speaker is James Renwick, Professor James Renwick. And he's a professor of geography at University of Wellington. In New Zealand, he is a New Zealand Climate Change Commissioner and awarded the 2018 New Zealand Prime Minister's Science Prize for Communication. And I assume communication is an important part of putting this message across. So good thing we've got you. He was also one of the leading authors, as I mentioned before, of the 2017 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that IPCC report, which was recognised with that Nobel Peace Prize alongside Dave. James has been involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change processes since the early 2000s and speaks regularly to the media on climate change issues. I also found out that he has very early morning starts or late evening sometimes to be zooming overseas to join these big international panels. So please welcome James Ringwood.
Thanks a lot for that introduction. So, yeah, it is a real pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for the invitation to come and participate today. Yeah, I guess if you win the Prime Minister's Science Communication Prize, communication must be important to you. And I think what Dave was saying is quite right. I mean, I love the science of the atmosphere, climate and meteorology, but I also recognise that doing science is not the answer on a problem that's so important for all of us. Climate change is affecting everyone's lives around the world, and it's making a lot of things harder than they were before. So you've got to get out of academia and get out and talk to people in the public, and that's actually something I love to do. And yeah, I don't understand why I've turned out to be quite good at this. I used to be terribly frightened of standing in front of an audience and speaking when I was young, like most people are. But some sort of switch flipped, I guess, and I've been doing this sort of thing for quite a long time now. And I started my professional career a little bit different, Dave, as a trainee weather forecaster at the Met Service in Wellington. So I used to be on the radio talking about storms and lows and fronts 40 odd years ago. And really, at that time, I wasn't thinking about climate change at all. It was all about the day-to-day changes in the weather, and I didn't think much beyond that. But over time, I moved from the day-to-day through to the month-to-month and the year-to-year, and realised, I guess, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that climate change was a super important problem. About the time that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change got started, I guess, and that it really was changing everything. So as time's gone on, I've moved more and more into thinking about how the climate varies and how it's changing. So yeah, the last 3 Intergovernmental Panel reports I've been working on. And I think that is it's the United Nations designated way of talking to policymakers globally. It's a good process. I guess what hasn't been so good so far is the response from policymakers, from society generally. I think there's a lot more concern now than there was 20 years ago, even 5 or 6 years ago, I would say. But we're still kind of waiting for things to happen. And I'd love to explore that whole area a bit more in the question time. What can we do? What power do we have if we have any? But yeah, Dave and I were just looking at the exhibition before we came in here, and it's hard to see the pictures and know that we're losing things that maybe not completely irreversible, but certainly won't be coming back in our lifetimes. Maybe it'll take thousands of years for some of the glaciers to freeze back up and so on. So we're changing the climate over the scale of thousands of years, many generations, and that's a pretty hard thing to think about. So I think taking some kind of action, doing something, is important to give you a feeling of some agency, and talking to people. One of the things I like to do is spread the word as much as we can about the kind of actions we can take. But yeah, I continue to work on research and looking at the moment at how Antarctica is changing and how sea ice around the Antarctica is varying. At the moment, Antarctic sea ice is at its lowest point in the record, which only goes back a bit over 40 years since we had satellites monitoring the sea ice effectively. But it's been weeks now that the sea ice around Antarctica has been lower than it's ever been recorded before. And of course, all of these signs are coming to worry. How long will it be before that ice comes back again? Anyway, that's enough for me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor James. I saw in the news recently that they're looking for people to come and help out down in Antarctica. I think that they need cooks and cleaners. Do we come to you to ask if you want to go down to Antarctica?
Sure, I'll pass it on to people who can actually do
So
something.
if you want 4 to 6 months in that icy patch we call Antarctica, please come and talk.
Yeah, that's a great point. You don't have to be a scientist to go to the ice. All of the people who support the science are really important as well. So yeah, if you're a baker or a plumber or anything really, yeah, if you want to go there, it's an amazing experience.
It gets pretty dark here, so maybe they need a candlestick maker as well.
Sure.
And certainly, last but certainly not least, we have a politician on the stage with us here today. And it's probably a weird thing to say because you're so young. And do you refer to yourself as a politician? We'll give it a couple more years and we'll be really good at it, really influential, and so therefore you can start referring to yourself as a politician. But we have had still influential. Good. I like that. That's better. Already influential. Very good. So we have the researcher, we have the policymaker, and now we have the one of the influential decision makers for the region. So really delighted to have Councillor Sophie Hanford here. And she was the national coordinator of the School Strike for Climate in New Zealand, which mobilised more than 170,000 people. Very influential, I'd say, maybe extremely influential. She was a youth member of Parliament, fashion ambassador for sustainable clothing label Kautau, the Girl Boss Sustainability Award winner, inaugural Impact Award recipient, 2019 New Zealand Tower Youth Award, committed to the environment and local housing trust volunteer, and now is New Zealand's youngest elected councillor for Kaipatiki Coast, voted as the councillor for Whirinaki Whare, is that right?
Hakakiriki don't mati.
Kia ora.
Close enough.
Perfect. Ward with 1,760 votes. Welcome, Councillor Sophie.
Kia ora te whānau, ko wainui tuku maunga, ko wainui tuku awa no Paikakiriki ahau, ko Bridget Pitford tōku mama, ko Peter Hanford tōku papa, ko Sophie Hanford tōku ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Wow. And before I begin, I just have to recognise too that the awards that have been read out are very much not mine alone, that those 170,000 people that were mentioned, who were mobilised, who came out in force, to demand action on climate change, to demand a vision of climate justice. Those awards and that recognition is very much for the collective and it's for the people power that we showed and that I believe we need to continue to keep showing to deliver and to remain strong in that mandate that our government should have and does have, I believe, to take urgent action on climate change. So I want to recognise that before I begin. So yes, my name is Sophie, I am 21 years old, was kind of almost thrust into the world of council at the age of 18, following on from coordinating the School Strike for Climate here in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2019. And the reason why I decided that kind of going into the political sphere would be the next step was thinking back to, through coordinating the School Strike for Climate, a moment which was pivotal to me at 12 years old. I have this kind of vivid memory of my parents receiving a letter in the mail from our local council, funnily enough at the time, essentially saying that because we live in Paikakiriki, which is a small seaside village on the Kapiti coast, that sea level rise, coastal erosion, increased severe weather events were going to have kind of this immeasurable impact on where I live, on the home that I've known my whole life, on the place that I've grown up. And then in having conversations further with my parents, with my whānau, knowing that there are actually already people on the front lines of these impacts right now. It's not only something that for me I was concerned about looking into the future and you know not knowing what the future might hold, but the fact that there are people in the Pacific right now who are having to flee their homelands, having to start thinking about fleeing their homelands, fleeing their culture, fleeing all that they've ever known because the water is literally at their doorsteps knocking. And that was the moment when I realised this is the moment in history where we need to decide what kind of ancestors we want to be, when so much hangs in the balance, but actually we have everything in our own hands to make things right. And knowing that we're the ones who have got ourselves into this deep, dark hole, as it might seem and as it sometimes feels, but we are the ones, those of us alive right now, who have this 8.5-year window to halve our emissions, to be in with a chance of passing on a livable planet to our next generation. And I want to be, and I know that I need to be, we all need to be a part of that change. And so, yes, understanding the reality, understanding how kind of dark and dire the reality feels and seems sometimes, but understanding that we need to just use all of the tools at our disposal right now to make things right. Because it comes back to my why, and I just want to finish with that, and why I feel like this is just the issue that needs to demand all of our action and time right now and be our focus, is because we need to ask ourselves what kind of history, what side of history we want to stand on. You know, when we're raising our children in the future, you know, when you're potentially, you know, saying your last words, when you're living your last moment, this is the planet that we'll be passing on to the next generation. So my why is that by the end of my life, I want to be able to say that I used everything at my disposal and use my voice to its full potential to speak up for our planet, which often does not have a voice in these conversations. And I do that for the next generation. I do that for those who aren't in this room, for those who are already on the front lines of the impacts in the Pacific, and for everyone who needs us, for the wildlife that needs us, for the creatures that we share this planet with that need us. We have to be the ones that save this entire planet. It's a big responsibility, but it's also a huge opportunity. So I say we just got to take it, show the momentum, use our people power, and do everything we can. So that's me.
Kia ora, Sophie. Thank you so much for that. Very inspiring words, and delighted to have you on the stage. So what we're going to do now is a period of questions, and if you do have a question, I'll kick a few off, but if you've got any, we've got Georgie over here with the roving mic, and more than welcome to ask that of the panel. So I'll open up these questions, and you're all welcome to answer them in any way that you want. And it'd be really interesting to get your perspective or views on it, which might be different as well. I'm sure you've been asked lots of questions before in the past, so you're welcome to a range of diverse answers. So, first question is it climate change? Are we, is this global warming? Or are we really at this climate crisis at the moment? Where are we? Where in your mind do you think we are?
I would answer that by saying that it's all of those things. The climate is changing around the world, and it's because the globe is warming, and it is a crisis. It is an emergency. Some of the aspects of climate change will take thousands of years to play out, you know, the melting ice and the rising sea levels and so on. But if we want to stop the change at a level that is at least a bit manageable, as Sophie was just saying, we've got this decade, this is the action decade. We have to reduce global emissions by half by the end of the decade and then get to zero by 2050. And that's a big ask, it's a huge ask, but it's a massive opportunity, and we have to be taking action right now. You know, the science has been clear for decades, and there's been no action, there's been the opposite of action. But we can still turn things around, but we have to start taking action today. Would be great. Yesterday would be even better, but we have to be on it because it really is an emergency. If we don't take the action this decade, well, ultimately a lot of people are going to get hurt and a lot of people are going to die. It's going to cost a lot in lives and in everything, basically. So there is no bigger problem to begin with. So there is no bigger opportunity for any of us to take up.
When people come and talk to you and say, well, there's been this huge eruption in Tonga that's emitted all this atmospheric, all this CO2 into the atmosphere, and you know, they say to you, is climate change caused by humans, or is it actually caused by the planet itself? And how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so the first correction there is that it's actually sulfur dioxide, mostly that it's emitted into the atmosphere. And a lot of that's gone into the stratosphere. The lifetime in the stratosphere might be a couple of years. So what you get is a cooling effect, maybe a degree or so. No one knows yet. But here's the thing, human beings in comparison with the stupid experiment that we've been doing since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution have changed the composition of the atmosphere far, far more than volcanoes ever would or have. What we see now with the atmosphere, when you look at atmospheric carbon dioxide, you can actually do kind of like DNA tracing on it. You can measure its isotopic composition, and human fingerprints are all over it. So both James and I have had to deal with climate deniers, and the classic one is, oh yeah, CO2, it's all natural. No, it's not. It's not all natural at all. We have increased the carbon dioxide concentration almost 50% over the last, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Some of that carbon dioxide will be removed quite quickly from the atmosphere, but some of it is essentially going to be there forever, for thousands of years, basically geological lifetimes. So I waver between being a pessimist and an optimist. I'm actually very optimistic when it comes to human ingenuity. We have the tools already to work on this problem. And as James said, we have to, this decade, reduce by a factor of 2 our emissions. We know how to do that. Why aren't we doing that? Well, I'm not a psychologist. There are many answers to that problem. Maybe Sophie knows. I'm optimistic about those tools that are out there, and I'm very optimistic about young people. I work very closely with one of the climate activists, a friend of Sophie's. That gives me hope. We can do this. We can do it. It's not going to be easy, but we can do it.
Would any of you like to answer that question?
If it's okay, I might just add something onto the first question, the answer that was provided. I think in terms of how we kind of coin climate change, or the label that we give to it now, we've seen obviously that, Parliament's declared a climate emergency, many councils across New Zealand have done the same, and if I just kind of think back to the experiences of School Strike Climate in 2019, we had young people, as young children, as young as 8 years old, jump on board with this movement because they were just frankly terrified about the kind of world that they'll be inheriting, and they already have that at the forefront of their minds. And so I think when we call it climate change, when we call it an emergency, when we call it whatever we do, I think young people are very much feeling it and seeing it as an emergency because of how much we can see it's going to affect our future. It's going to be what, this is literally, as was mentioned, the defining decade for the future that young people now will then have to navigate their careers through, will then have to raise children through. And so I think there's a huge kind of stake that young people feel, I think, both in, in kind of the world that we're inheriting, simply because of the ability we have to look forward and go, well, we've still got this huge chunk of our life that we haven't actually had the chance to experience. And what kind of situation and scenario will we have to be navigating that through? And I think that's frankly quite scary. And that's why we saw, kids as young as 8 years old jump on board and say, I want to dedicate every weekend to fighting for this. And it does make me feel kind of heartbroken to think that young people are already feeling that burden. I mean, I feel it 100%, but to lift myself out of that and to go, yes, we've got a climate emergency, it's here and now. Actually, we've got a vision of climate justice to get working on. And so I think we can, if we focus on those opportunities that come with addressing the crisis, through centering the voices of young people, through capitalising on this awesome momentum that we've got at the moment with, the school strikes having happened and with our government starting to look like they're, beginning to take this more seriously, I think we need to also kind of remember that there are people who are feeling scared and who are feeling anxious about the state of our world and what's to come in the future. And through the way we address it and the way we communicate it, we can help hopefully empower action instead of kind of continuing to give to that feeling of hopelessness. And and anxiousness about the situation.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. That was one of the questions I was going to come up with a bit later on, is how is climate change affecting us? And we talked about psychological effects for young people, which is fantastic. David and James, have you got any thoughts about what you're seeing as well across New Zealand or globally around climate change and the effects it's having on people?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, they're quite different. The first is there's been a huge change in awareness. When I first started making these measurements 50 years ago now, extraordinary, there was no awareness. Can you imagine a young kid, 23-year-old, going to a party? Well, what do you do, Dave? Well, I make measurements of this gas and this stuff all of it there, and it might be changing the climate. Well, is the climate changing? Well, I don't know, actually. To now, when it's very clear that we are really up against it, with climate change very visible right around the planet. But the other big change to me is journalism, responsible journalism. What you see now is investigative reporters won't have a bar. They don't give any oxygen to climate deniers, and that marks a very big change and makes me quite optimistic.
I'd echo what Dave just said. And I think in the last 5 or 6 years there has been a real shift in public perceptions and public voice. I think the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report in 2018 on what 1.5 degrees of warming would look like and what more than that would look like, how much worse that would be, and what we need to do to stop the warming at 1.5 degrees. That really triggered off, combined with, I guess, Greta Thunberg getting a bit of press, the school strike movement, the Fridays for Future movement around the world, and then Extinction Rebellion as an organisation has just shifted the dial of the conversation, I think, with the public, really hugely. 10 years ago, yes, people knew about climate change, but I don't know that a lot of people I met were that concerned about it. Whereas now, I think it's really at the forefront, and it's in the press a lot more now, and unfortunately, partly that's because of all the terrible extreme events we've seen in the last few years, the fires and the floods and the droughts and so on. So I think there's been a big shift in the sort of public noise that's being made, and I hope that's having an effect at the policy level. There's a long way to go yet, but yeah, things have certainly changed, both in this country, and Sophie's a fantastic example of what's happening locally, but globally. I think the networks of especially young activists are really strong. And in a funny kind of way, the pandemic has sort of strengthened things. We're all on Zoom meetings all the time, and I think people in different countries have become even better at linking up and mobilising themselves electronically, and I think that's it's a really interesting development, and hopefully a really exciting way that we can help change things quickly.
Now, I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then after that, I'll put it out to the audience. So if you've got any questions, please indicate that to Georgie over there, and she'll be able to pick that up. So far, what we've identified is that we are in a climate crisis, that it is human-made, and the effects it's having on us as people. But what is happening globally? What is happening? What is the threats of climate change globally, and also locally? What are we seeing locally here?
Again, and I think this is, it's maybe hard for me to say what people generally do know about climate change, because I'm so in the thick of it all the time, but we know that sea levels are rising around the globe. We know that it's getting warmer everywhere, and that means more hot days, more heat waves, and that goes along with more droughts, difficulties for agriculture. But at the other end of the scale, because a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, or it can hold more moisture, moisture. When you get a storm, you tend to have heavier rainfalls and bigger floods and more slips and so on. So the extremes of rainfall are changing around the world at different ways in different places. But sea levels are rising around all of the globe's coasts, and we're seeing just a more extreme set of weather events. Tropical cyclones develop to maximum intensity faster, and more of them become more intense, so that the risks, or at least the hazards, are increasing in intensity all the time. And I don't think Aotearoa's exceptionally different to the global picture. Temperatures in this country have risen about at the global rate. Sea levels are rising at about the global rate. So no part of the globe gets a free pass on climate change. It really is global warming, global change. And I think the need to adapt differs in different places, even within a country like Aotearoa, New Zealand, and certainly in different countries around the world. I guess in Switzerland, sea level rise isn't such an issue, but the melting of ice and glaciers is a huge problem. So individual communities have to find their own ways and identify their own problems and find ways to adapt to what's happening, as well as take action on what's called mitigation, or reducing emissions to stop this problem getting much worse than it already is.
So do you want to answer that as well? You mentioned before a bit more about the sea level rise in the Pacific and the effect it's having on immigration, people having to come and live in New Zealand or other parts of the world, actually having to move because their homeland is gone. Do you want to mention something?
Yeah, so I feel incredibly kind of grateful to get to work alongside some amazing Pacifica youth activists, and as James has mentioned, the network of youth activists in the climate justice space is really strong. We're all trying to amplify each other's messages and stories where we can, and working in with some of the Pacific climate warriors who have whānau over in the Pacific, in Samoa and Tonga and Tuvalu and Tokelau, and the message very much though that they're kind of sending to us from their whānau is that they're not drowning, they're fighting. They don't want to drown in, the rising sea levels in their homelands. They instead want to make sure that they can stay there with dignity and that they're supported to do so, whether that's through, global neighbours and us as a Pacific country, being able to support our Pacifica whānau to remain in their homelands, because it's very much a real threat. I had the opportunity to work alongside Anganga Lefili from For the Culture, who lives up in South Auckland, and she established this group as a space for young Pacifica youth, to be able to kind of come together around their friends and people who kind of have a similar connection to the issue of climate change. And the reason, or kind of one of the things that kind of sparked her interest or her work in the climate space was doing some research and finding out that actually Tuvalu is listed as a place that could become extinct, or a place that is almost an endangered, it's categorised as an endangered country. And so she was like, what does that mean? And that essentially means that it could be gone. And so for her to then understand that that's connected back to her culture and the culture of her friends and her whānau is huge. And so I really think that those impacts kind of can't be let go or can't be kind of looked upon, but instead we need to take extremely seriously. And would echo James's comments about kind of those solutions at a local level too. I think it's important to understand what local adaptation solutions can look like, but also local mitigation solutions, so to reduce emissions, understanding what kind of profile of what kind of proportion of emissions in specific areas come from various contributors. So for example, in Kapiti, 56% of our emissions are transport related. So our mitigation solutions to reduce emissions, to then hopefully be contributing less to the global picture, will look different potentially to Upper Hutt. So there's kind of that local lens. But yeah, we'll just add that it's important for us all, I think, to open our hearts and our minds to the realities of some people now, and to make sure that those voices are also contributing to our understanding of how climate change is affecting the globe.
Yeah, Sophie, I just couldn't agree more. And I think I'd like to fire out a question to this audience here. Something which has really bothered me for a long time. And it goes like this. Here's the question. What are the rights of the individual versus the needs of the many? And there are lots of examples of this, and I'm not going to go into vaccination, but
That's in another room, David.
that's in another room. Here's the thing. Not far from us, there is a mortgage broker. He drives a Ford Ranger, which is covered with the logos of the mortgage broking company. He doesn't need a Ford Ranger. I mean, he doesn't carry money in the back of it. That thing does 20 litres 100, and he has a complete right as an individual to drive that in New Zealand. He even gets a tax write-off from the IRD because he's got his logo on it, and it has 4 seats. But what about the people in Tuvalu? What about their needs? He, with this massive bloody thing, is contributing a huge amount to the New Zealand's emissions of CO2. So that's my question to you. What are your rights here in New Zealand in terms of CO2 emissions versus the people in Tuvalu who are really, really up against it? And this is something that we, all of us personally, are going to have to get to grips with, because all of us are responsible for reducing emissions. We have to do this.
David, maybe I put the question back to you. If we have an individual who's making a contribution towards climate change, what do you think should be the national or even global response to that?
Okay. Well,
They weren't going to be easy questions, David.
Yeah. I'll give you an extremely local one. Our son thinks that people like that belong in jail. But I'm not going to go there. Well, clearly the national response is the same as the universal one. We have to have that word regulations. We have to have mechanisms, whether they're economic instruments or otherwise, that actually help us, to the individuals, to reduce carbon emissions. And in the example of transport, an obvious one is what's called a fee bay, where you actually penalise people who drive Ford Rangers and you reward people who drive low emissions vehicles, whether they're hybrids or electric. That has to come, and it has to come quickly, because as Sophie said, 8.5 years, by 2030, our emissions should be down by a factor of 2 and net zero by 2050.
What does the rest of the panel think? I mean, are there any examples overseas of countries you've looked at and said, wow, they're doing a fantastic job, should we do that? Or is this something that we have to think, actually, do we need to be the world leader in this? Is this something that we need to move on?
Oh boy. I can't list any countries where I think, they've nailed it. Some countries are doing well in some areas and others not so much. But just listening to all of this, I'm thinking about the sort of tension between individual action and societal action. And yep, all of us can do things to reduce our own carbon footprint, whether it's LED lights at home or an electric vehicle or whatever works for you or whatever you can afford to do, I suppose. But right now, it's still quite hard to be green. It's not the default choice when you go to a car yard is not an electric vehicle, and if there is an electric vehicle, it probably costs 50% more than the typical petrol-powered vehicle. So we need change across the whole of society and the whole of the economy, actually, and that's where governments come in, as Dave was saying, and it's where big business comes in. So, yeah, we can all do our bit for sure, but until it becomes easy to take the green choice, it's not going to happen very easily. And sure, we can all start now or years ago probably for a lot of us and make those kind of choices. But as it is made easier to do those things, it will become the standard thing to do. So that's why I think the best thing anyone can do on climate change is just do what I'm doing right now and talk about it. Just make it normal to talk about the problem in the way that we talk about the America's Cup or the rugby or, what the Prime Minister wore to Waitangi, or whatever, you know, celebrity culture. If we make it normal to talk about what's happening with climate change, we're going to think about it more, we're going to care about it more, and we're going to take action more. And it's that collective voice and that collective response that is most important. And I don't know that that has really happened in any country in the world yet. But I think you mentioned the idea of a global leadership. There's no reason why this country couldn't be the global leader on action on climate change. Sure, our total emissions are small compared to China or India or the US, but somebody has to lead. And we're needing a total revolution in how we produce energy. Being at the forefront of a revolution is generally good news for those countries that do it. You know, the British literally took over the world at the last industrial revolution, which put us on the path we're on now. If Aotearoa is leading the way, we can at least inspire other countries, and we can probably do very well for ourselves out of being the leaders rather than the laggards. So, yeah, I would like to think that this country can absolutely lead, and individuals, all of us, can help the government understand what it is they need to do.
Yeah, I would just 100% agree with everything that James has said there. I think linking that back to the collective, I think if we want to have as many people as possible talking and thinking about climate change as they go about their day-to-day life, but as they're thinking about their future, if we want to have systems change, both of those require action from the collective, but we need to also be that change before we can talk about it, before we can help to inspire other people, I think, too. So I very much believe in kind of us as individuals being the change the world needs, and also at a countrywide level, also, you know, in individual communities and based in our own individual contexts. Being the change that the world needs. And to me, that looks like just slowing down a little bit, being more conscious, you know, being conscious consumers, being conscious decision makers. When we're leaving the house and we're thinking about how to get from A to B, we stop, we think, okay, what are my options? And yes, some people at this current moment in time will have more options, just potentially because of, you know, how much money they have, their, you know, where they might be living, the job that they might have, whatever that might be. But still, you know, slowing down and being conscious of the way we're choosing to consume, how we're choosing to consume, and recognising that consumption happens in so many different ways. When we jump in our car, we are actually consuming fossil fuels. When we jump on a bike and we ride our e-bike, we are likely to then be consuming renewable electricity. And so there are positive things that we can do that will, I think, then help to kind of spark change in others. But yeah, I really believe in kind of us being the change we want to see. And if we want to see our government and our leaders doing more, then I think we have to be making sure that, you know, we're also taking on some of that responsibility too, while recognising that there's so much power in the system to enable us to do those things more easily and to allow those options to more people. So I would say it's kind of a bit of both. And the fact that, there's so much opportunity with this tiny window of time actually that we have, which is kind of like a bit of a blip, where, if we don't just take all of those opportunities at our disposal, then, you know, will we look back and go, damn, I wish we did. I wish I did. And I wish that I, you know, used my voice more. I wish that I took every opportunity I had to speak to a member of parliament, or to go to an event to listen, or to ride my bike, or to just experience nature and build my connection with nature. So I would just say every moment's an opportunity, and if you're conscious in every moment about how you're spending your time, because that can have an impact, your money, because that can also have an impact, and also using your voice, those things can all have an impact and make huge ripple effects. So be the change, and I think New Zealand really has to be the change too, because there are so many things right now that are kind of lining up to enable us to do that best. And so I think we really need to just stand up and go, we're going to aspire, we're going to commit, we're going to aim high, we're going to share and spread a vision of hope with the world, because I think the world really needs it right now, and we're going to present the solutions and put our best foot forward, because I think that's just what's necessary, and we can hear that, you know, this change is really needed. And so what's it going to take? That's the thing that I can't really get my head around, is we've got the science, we've got the solutions, it seems like we've got a lot of will. When are we just going to kind of crack on and make this stuff happen? And I think it does start with us.
Now, I'm going to fire it out to the audience. What do you, Dave did ask a really great question. Is there anyone out there that wants to give their thoughts on it or even ask a question of the panel? Down the front here.
Hi. Really appreciated your contribution, Sophie, James, and Dave. I like the idea of leadership. I mean, New Zealand clearly led the world in relation to our stance on nuclear weapons. The problems in terms of international leadership is that our economy is filthy in terms of carbon. In a normal year, our leading sources of international exchange are international aviation, via our tourist industry, and dairy and beef. So if we're going to make any meaningful change, we need to have a look at those major industries. I'm not detracting what we as individuals should do, but if we are going to be the leaders, we have to make the change. And at the moment, we've got a government that is subsidising in New Zealand, that has actually excluded the agricultural sector from the emissions trading scheme, and has got a never-ending series of excuses why we shouldn't do more in that area. So my question is, we need economy-wide changes. How do we get there?
Yeah, so tackling the agricultural industry, imagine this, 8 billion people all eating beef. The world's population, human population, is projected to go up to around 10 billion. The planet cannot support 10 billion people eating beef. It's just not going to happen. Take that back, dial that back to New Zealand. We have to drastically change farming in New Zealand. It just cannot go on that you have pastoral farming, which comes at the expense of ripping out native bush and all the rest of it, to have lumbering rate beasts producing protein at the expense of polluted waterways and all the rest of it. There are so many other ways of producing protein using plant-based products. In the talks I give, I have a wonderful picture of a young black American getting stuck into a hamburger. Except it's not a hamburger. It's called Beyond Meat, or an Impossible Burger. And I tried it, and it's for all the world like a beef patty. And so here's the thing, that technology is already there, and I think farmers should be worried about it, because it's getting cheaper every day. This country, when it was shut out of what was then called the EC, and we were told that this is 40 years ago that farming was going to collapse. It didn't. It diversified. We now have a multi-billion-dollar wine industry, and we have a huge horticulture industry. We cannot continue with pastoral farming. Not the least of it is methane emissions. So that has to change, and it may be forced to change by these new innovations. But I would say to everyone, drop your consumption of red meat. You know, really, you don't need it. I'm not a vegetarian, but my wife and I get by with very, very little meat. And hey, I still rode a bike 35k on the Kapiti Coast yesterday.
I heard it was
We
a
have
high
to
wind.
change.
It was a high wind as well.
There was no wind.
No. That's right.
Yeah, it's a really hard question, isn't it? And just to visualise, how do we go from where we are now to where we need to be? I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but the things Dave's saying about agriculture, absolutely, and the agriculture sector is super adaptive, because the mix of what farmers do now is very different to what they were doing 40 years ago. And there's no reason to suppose that in 40 years from now, the farming sector couldn't look quite different again. It's something like, relying on tourism, and I think it's going to be a long time before there's a fuel that's energy dense enough to actually get planes around the world that isn't fossil fuel. I don't know if it'll ever happen. So it's been really interesting to watch what's happened, and I shouldn't say something like interesting, it's terrible, devastating, to see what's happened with the pandemic, and not only the loss of life and so on through the disease, but the loss of livelihoods for people in the tourist industry. I don't want to see anybody suffer, but we have seen not quite a close down, but almost a close down in our tourist sector. And that's forced people to start to think about, well, what are they going to do instead? And if we have tourists coming here, what's that going to look like? Are we going to have few people who stay for a long time and do different things, rather than huge plane loads of people who come just for a weekend to visit a couple of hotspots, literally, and then fly home again? So just rethinking how we market ourselves, I suppose, as a tourist destination, whether we do that at all, or whether we find other ways to make money. Again, it's not as though this country has to be reliant on tourism. It wasn't until fairly recently, as far as I know. So just being creative about what it is we can do, I think. And it's one thing I think a lot. Climate change is the biggest problem we face, and we should be getting the most ideas and the most brains and the most resources into thinking about alternatives. I'm not necessarily a guru on that, but there are lots and lots of different ways economies can be powered or fueled by money, if you want to put it that way, that don't involve the things that are crucially important to the New Zealand economy right now. So I don't have a real answer, but I think there are answers out there, and we just need to get on and think of it and try things, diversify the way we operate and just see what works.
Yeah, I agree with James on that too. And something that I'm always trying to grapple with is, who are we trying to deliver for in the midst of all of this? What's the purpose of decision making? What's the purpose of all of these various things? And ultimately that comes down to what our economic system values and what kind of our desired outcomes are. And so getting down to focusing on those things and then figuring out how we're going to get there. And obviously by continuing to allow exploration and extraction of oil and gas in New Zealand, it's not going to get us to being a clean green country. It's not going to, aid us in improving, as you say, those kind of dirty elements of our economy, and the fact that we do coin ourselves as a clean green country and that we can't actually claim that. And so that's one of the things that I'm kind of often thinking about is, okay, how are we measuring what matters? Is uncharted economic growth and a continued focus on economic growth or even sustainable growth, is that actually going to deliver for the next generation? What are we trying to achieve? It'll just mean that people keep climbing up these ladders. What are the ladders even there for? What's the purpose? What's the purpose to all of this? And so that's one of the things that I just can't quite get my head around. I don't have a solution as to how we communicate that, or as to how we necessarily make sure that our politicians and people in leadership roles of various companies and sectors kind of get a grip on that. But one insight that I do have, I had the opportunity to meet with the Institute of Petroleum Association of New Zealand, and I asked must have been the chair of the CEO of their group, kind of why he did what he did, or what was his kind of motive in coming to work every day, and what was it that got him into the industry of petroleum. And the response that I had back was pride. I'm really proud to be paving the way for my children to then kind of inherit this life that I would have built for myself and would have therefore built for them. And so it's just that complete and utter disconnection with what the industry that he's working in is actually doing to the planet. And so I think, again, measuring what matters, he seems to be measuring that success and the monetary value that he's going to be able to pass on to his kids, but what good is money if we don't have a planet for that economy to even exist on? So that is the struggle of this, 100% the struggle. But I think also we have to collectively provide that mandate for our leaders to keep doing more and to make sure they know that they've got the backing of the public. That's one of the reasons why School Strike for Climate wasn't necessarily saying, we need you to do this now, we demand this of you. Obviously that was, we tried to make sure there was urgency and that kind of real kind of sense of urgency and demand through what we were saying, but it was more like, we're here to work with you. We are here to help provide you with the social mandate, the collective mandate to go further, to do more, because we know that it's in your best interests, it's in our best interest as a country. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, it's in your best interest to look after your baby Neve, and we're going to try and be here to help you to do that. And so I think the more that we can kind of create that solidarity and create that camaraderie behind a vision of climate justice to show that there's a mandate, it'll only help our leaders to go further. If the whole of New Zealand showed up on the doorsteps of Parliament and said, cut this, we know we need to reduce stock sizes, we know we need to end oil and gas exploration and extraction in New Zealand, we need to implement climate education, we need to subsidise public transport, make it free, we need to continue to incentivise active modes of transport, walking and cycling. They couldn't just turn around and say, oh, sorry, because we hold the power to vote. And we hold that in our own hands. We hold the power to vote with our dollar and also to vote when it comes around to the elections, both local government and central government. And so I think hopefully that makes some kind of sense, but I see it as kind of multi-pronged, is that we've got to measure what matters and think about ultimately who and what the system is trying to deliver for and is trying to deliver in terms of outcomes. And if the system's not working, well then we have to be the ones that provide the social mandate for it to change. And so, that's where my thinking's at, but recognising too that I don't have all the answers at all.
Kia ora. Listen, I can see there's a few more questions in the audience, but just before we get into that, do we have any farmers who are in the audience today? No? Farmer's daughter, fantastic. Listen, obviously the rural sector is a really important part of this conversation. And if I was a farmer, you'd be like, well, what about my yield and I've got my contracts with dairy or beef or whatever it might be. So one of the things that I've been thinking of lately is that you've got government agencies, you've got councils who've got these CO2 targets now, zero net emissions, and they'd be scratching their heads thinking, well, I can convert certain buildings off carbon and so forth, but actually I'm going to have to do offsetting. And I've been looking at the cost of carbon. It has been going through the roof ever since those caps were taken off, and you can see that the cost is rising and rising. And there's only, the government does have its carbon capture. Where do we, when you're thinking about it, the only way that we can offset, and I know that that's not the solution, long-term solution, but there'll be a lot of people out there in agencies thinking, how do I offset this? And land, you need land to plant on. And I'm wondering, do you think that in the future, it'll be more financially beneficial for farmers to plant up land to get carbon credits from than to get the yield of the industrialised application of farming and so forth in the future?
Look, sorry about this, Rob. Here's the thing. Economics, you talk about costs. We've got it completely back to front. And the reason is that we have never, ever costed the damage to our only atmosphere by firing CO2 emissions into it. So people, it's going to be too expensive to reduce my carbon emissions. Well, hey, what's the cost of 1 billion dead animals in Australia due to unprecedented fires triggered by climate change? We've never really done what a sustainable economist would do, sit back and say, yeah, hey, we're damaging our only atmosphere. Sorry, if you want to emit carbon dioxide into it by driving your Ford Ranger, these are going to be the costs, the so-called ute tax. We just haven't done that. So somehow, I'm not an economist, but we've got to change the whole way we think when we use that word cost to include the damage to the atmosphere. So you're saying the price of carbon's going up? I doubt whether it's nowhere near enough. I'd say it's nowhere near enough to factor in. Jim talked about heat waves. The costs that are coming up generated by worsening, dangerous climate change are colossal. We have to change our whole economic system.
It's a very fair point. In fact, I think recently released a report on insurance claims. And it's just phenomenal, the cost of insurance and how much that's going up as an impact of the effects of climate change. Does anyone else would like to answer that question?
Maybe I could just add a little bit, just thinking as you were talking about this idea that, farmers are the problem or any sector of society or the economy is the problem. That's not the way to think about it. That it's not that we need the farming community to do something like bad people or something. We all have to play a part. So yeah, sure, farming practices have to change, and the legislation in the Zero Carbon Act talks about how much methane emissions have to reduce and all the rest of it, and that's the law. We've got to do this if we were serious about stopping global warming and something that's sort of manageable. Then everyone has to play a part. So I'd like to think we can all work together, and it's not a question of people who live in cities pointing the finger at people who are on farms or vice versa. The more cooperation we can have, the faster and better we can do things. And it has bothered me the last few years, just jumping into the international scene now. There's been a reduction in cooperation, the sort of rise of nationalist politics and people sort of cutting themselves off from other countries. Just gets in the way of that kind of cooperation that we actually need. So I think keeping that in mind is really important. But just a point you mentioned about, is it going to be more, is it going to provide a better return for a farmer to plant trees than run cows? I mean, totally taking on what Dave was saying about the way the economy works. But yeah, maybe it will be in the short term. And tree planting and offsetting, that is quite a valid thing to do. It buys us a bit of time in the short term. We need to turn off the tap of emissions completely eventually. But maybe under the present economic settings, it will be more valuable for farmers. Some farmers do that. And if it is, I'd say go right ahead, because it will be good for the climate.
Great. So we've got another question down the front here. I see, and then I can see another one at the back.
Kia ora, Ross Brown, ka rosaho. Thank you for your wonderful communication and education that you're giving us this afternoon. And Dave's book is available from the Hutt City Library. My question is a very local question, which also is for the whole of Aotearoa. Peatlands and wetlands. Can we mobilise a massive movement to make man-made peatlands, wetlands, to restore what we have, and to just say stop, and also acknowledge that we have to ask our question and reaffirm our little thing. I have what I need what I have, and all the rest is a surplus. Over to you, panel. Good luck with how we're going to get those wetlands and peatlands restored and improved.
What a wonderful question. So I'll just make a brief comment. You look around this country and there are fantastic volunteer organisations working with DOC to return peatlands and wetlands. And they're up on the Kapiti coast, well worth looking at. And yeah, they are sinks for carbon dioxide, incredibly valuable thing to do. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, absolutely. My answer to the question is yes. Anything we can do to, I guess, restore peatlands, wetlands, bush, regenerative agriculture, all of those approaches to, it could be coastal, sand dune environments, sort of natural environments. Any restoration we can do is going to be a good thing. So, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I would say yes, absolutely, 100% as well. And I think in us talking about, obviously, the crisis that we're in the midst of, doing something like you mentioned will then mean that anyone in the community who goes, where do I start, can then come together with a group of people who have kind of a similar view of the solution and can then all just like muck in and help with the restoration. And so I think it provides a really awesome opportunity for collective action. And on top of that too, I think there are so many solutions to the climate crisis which are very intersectional. So for example, obviously it can act as a sink, carbon sink, but it can also act as a place and a haven for biodiversity and increased biodiversity. So I don't think we can underestimate the potential of our solutions to kind of provide opportunities in more than one area of environmental justice. And yeah, ultimately I just think go for it. If that's a passion that you particularly have, chat to some friends, chat to some people who you think might also be interested in and see what you can get going. Because I think there are many groups who are being open to supporting something like that and and encouraging you to keep talking about it with others. So I think it's a great idea.
Thank you. We've got a question right at the back, top there.
can we dig into a little bit like the next 5 years? Because if we have this 10-year really important period, the next 5 years of that are going to be extra important. And we know that we have the emission reduction plan coming out in May, which is going to be chocker full of actions, just looking at the consultation document that had heaps of stuff in it, across the whole economy. I just wondered if the panelists could dig into what they see happening in New Zealand over the next 5 or so years, just to really sort of ground our emission reduction response and like what's probably going to be happening on the ground, how can we make that better, just to make it a bit more pragmatic, because we talk a lot about being inspired and being optimistic, but like a lot of people I know in my like extended family don't operate in that space, like they are farmers, they just want to know like what's going to happen, and what are the very, very practical things that they can do. So something in that in-between space would be really cool to have some comments on.
Kia ora. Excellent question. Thank you for that. Obviously, the government's going to be coming out with a plan very soon. And I guess, do you mind if I just split that into 2 parts? One is, what do you want the government to say? And then the second one is, what can we do as individuals? And especially in that period, in the next sort of 10 to 15 years? Great.
Yeah, great question. And on what government can do, or what changes might happen or should happen in the next few years. It's pretty well, first of all, just before I start on that, just to go back to the Zero Carbon Act that was passed in 2019, talks about getting to net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. And carbon dioxide is the key greenhouse gas just because it stays in the air for so long, hundreds to thousands of years. Methane is what agriculture emits most of, and it's a really potent greenhouse gas, but it only stays in the air on average for 12 years or so. So as soon as you start turning down the tap of methane emissions, the amount of it in the air starts to go down a bit. Whereas for carbon dioxide, you've got to get to zero just to stabilise the amount in the atmosphere, and you're going to be spending hundreds of years through the usual mechanisms that operate on the planet to start to reduce it. So getting the CO2 to zero is crucial. And it's pretty well known in this country that the main sectors where the carbon dioxide emissions are happening are in transport. That's where most of the growth has been in the last 30 years. And then in industry and energy production, heat production, warming buildings or drying out milk to make milk powder or whatever it might be. So what I want to see and what I hope the government will promote over the next few years is reducing transport emissions by really ramping up funding for public transport and making public transport free. I think is a brilliant idea. That should be the case for everybody. Providing infrastructure for electric vehicles and having some kind of rebate or some sort of scheme to make electric vehicles more affordable generally. And enabling active transport, bicycles and walking and so on. Just being more conscious about making our transport system as low carbon as it possibly can be. And on the sort of energy and industry side, it's already starting that coal boilers are being phased out, and there's this push for public service to be carbon neutral by 2025. That's coming up pretty soon. So reducing the use of coal to heat schools, all that kind of thing in the public sector, but also in the business sector, switching gas-fired heating for solar panels, for instance, that kind of thing. So I'd like to think we'll see that sort of change in infrastructure. No reason why it couldn't start tomorrow, we could see that coming in over the next few years. And I like to see the electric vehicle charging stations in the car park at my local supermarket. That kind of thing just being rolled out generally across the country. In terms of what individuals can do, I was thinking about this quite a lot before I came along today, and I think the first thing anyone can do is to understand that we all have power. It's easy to think, it's this huge global problem. There's nothing I can do to make a difference. Well, actually, everyone has power to make a difference. So understanding that is the first thing. And like I said before, the next thing I think is talking about it, just getting everyone and as many people as, all of your whānau, your workmates, make yourself really unpopular, gab on about climate change all the time. And, that has an effect. I'm sure it has an effect on people's thinking. They go away thinking, oh, yeah, maybe this is a problem after all. So just doing something, anything, to give yourself a sense of agency, because it is easy to become apathetic and sort of switched off and get into a bit of a doomist mindset. And I think the best way to fight that is to do something. It might be something tiny, you've used your car one day less a week this week. It's still an action. It still adds up to the kind of solutions we need. So just think of ways that you can take any kind of action. Writing, getting in touch with your member of parliament, that's a political action. Sending an email, press send. You don't even have to get out of your chair to do that. You can just get your phone out and do it right now. If enough people did those kinds of things, that would make a difference. We have collective power to really change. We've already changed the climate amazingly, and that was just human activity. We have all the power in the world to fix this problem.
Yeah, just to add on and maybe emphasise a couple of points that James was made, just kind of making a bit of a list here of all the things that I could think of. So yeah, public transport being free. There's already a campaign, Free Fares campaign, organised by the Aotearoa Collective for Public Transport Equity. So we'd definitely check out their mahi and potentially consider adding your name to their demands. They did put something in to the budget kind of budget statement and through that consultation as well to try and get that as something that's key in this year's budget, because the government has mentioned that budget 2022 is the year for climate spend. It's the year to put money aside and actually start spending now on some of those solutions that we'll see being rolled out over the next 5 years. So I would encourage all of us to kind of stay up to date with what's happening in that space. I know the submissions have closed, but it's things like that where, I came across it on the Parliament website and thought, okay, Finance and Expenditure Committee takes 5 minutes of my time to make an oral submission just to say, you've said that climate change is one of your kind of key drivers for Budget 2022 this year and something that you want to focus on. We've got to see it. And you've got to show that through actually what proportion of spending is allocated towards some of these solutions. So there are processes and things happening all the time, and so many things which intersect with our climate response too. So it's important that we're making our voice heard at that level, as James has already mentioned. But yes, public transport being free, an increase of walking and cycling infrastructure, and even why not roll out, or why not discount something like an e-bike subsidy. How are we enabling and supporting people to purchase e-bikes, which are a pretty good intermediary form of transport. I think something that we'll see happening over the next kind of 5 to 10 years too is more of a conversation about intensification, because we can't continue to allow our communities to sprawl, building houses further and further away from public transport, which we know we need to be using more and more to reduce our emissions from transport, which seem to just keep increasing, which is obviously not the direction that they need to be heading in. So I think, that conversation around intensification in our towns currently looking a little bit more like cities in the next 5 to 10 years, it's a very real thing, and something that in turn will hopefully reduce emissions by enabling active modes of transport, people being closer to where they work and where they potentially take their kids to school. Public service being carbon neutral by 2025, that will start to kind of show some changes potentially quite materially. Taking coal boilers out of schools. There are still some schools which are coal powered, which seems kind of crazy. So things like that. Another thing that I'd like to see is an end to oil and gas exploration and extraction in New Zealand. Just this year in January, there was another oil and gas rig that was allowed to enter New Zealand to head up to Taranaki to continue exploring for oil off the coast. And we know that we have more oil and gas in our reserves than we can afford to burn if we are to avoid this catastrophic climate feedback loops and everything that's happening to our planet. So I think we just need to see some really clear commitment to an end. And if there isn't a plan to roll all that stuff out immediately, we just need to commit. And that's kind of my hope and something that I'm, optimistic that will come in the next 5 or so years. Another thing that I see as being really important is the implementation of climate education in schools. because, and not only in schools actually, but with the general public. Because as I mentioned, we're seeing children as young as 8 years old coming to groups like School Strike for Climate and saying, I'm terrified, I've seen photos of, dying polar bears who are just gripping to an iceberg and they're floating away from their mums and dads, and it's just like, how are we supposed to instill hope in our young people about what's to come and the role that they can play in the solutions? And so I think that doesn't just extend to our young people, but also is important for our general public to be aware of. So I'd like to see some real investment in how we communicate both what the solutions might bring in terms of changes to people's day-to-day life, because yes, day-to-day life will need to look different, and I don't think we can be kind of too afraid of change. And I think actually if we are afraid of change, or we're kind of complacent in the way things are and we're like, cool, business as usual, like it's serving me pretty well, actually in the future things are going to be a lot harder and practices will have to change far more drastically than if we just bite the bullet and go, yep, we're going to accept that things will have to change, but it's going to be better for us in the long run, it's going to be better for our farming practices in the long run, better for the next generation to then inherit this farm, this investment. And so I think that's where I'd like to see focus in as well, is ensuring that the public is aware of the fact that, yep, now's the moment. It can be a just transition. There are so many opportunities for people who will be most affected to be brought along for the journey. And we just have to have those slightly challenging conversations, because yes, it's not going to be easy for people to talk about, oh, well, I might have to be, changing the way I live or losing this part of my life or whatever. But things are going to be a whole lot harder in the long run if we don't just have these hard conversations now. And so, yes, it's a challenge, and yes, there'll be people who will resist it. But I think if we have that kind of public education and education within our young people, that hopefully the dial will continue to shift even more. But yeah, would encourage you just to kind of be across the things that are happening. As you said, the emissions reduction plan is a really kind of important milestone in our country's efforts to tackle climate change, but it's only so good as what it says. It's only so good as then what happens as a result of it. So we just have to keep the pressure on, would be just about all I can say.
Good.
Yeah, going back to your question, as James said, I think it was brilliant. James really talked about the government level. I thought, from my perspective, I'd talk about the individual level. A lot of people wonder, what are my carbon emissions? And of course, there are lots of carbon calculators out there. Many of them are really confusing and pretty hard to figure. So I'd like to give you a bit of a tip. Have a look at the Auckland City Council carbon calculator. It's called FutureFit. It really works extremely well. It gives you a lot of feedback mechanisms, sends you very annoying emails if you haven't put any data in. And to give you an example, my wife and I, we moved from Plympton to Petone around about 5 or 6 years ago. When we were in Plympton, we had 2 petrol cars, and our emissions were 15 tonnes per person per year, CO2 equivalents. Moving to Petone, having an electric car and electric bikes, using public transport and walking, we've dropped that down to 7 tonnes. Now we have to, this decade, drop that down to around 2.5 tonnes, because the world average emissions at the moment are around about 5 tonnes per person for the 8 billion people on the planet. So it's a hard ask, but it is doable. The big one for New Zealanders is transport. Have a really good look at what you're doing. As Sophie said, do you really need to jump into that car? She mentioned e-bikes. We use e-bikes. We use them for shopping. James, we can carry an awful lot of craft beer with an e-bike.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the energy that makes it go.
Yeah, so there are techniques and technology out there that at an individual level we can all make a huge difference. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, panel. I'll take a few more questions. I know there was someone around the middle who had a question.
Well, that was me. It's crazy testing.
Oh, we'll just wait for the mic's on its way.
Actually, my question has been answered in the last question, but I'm just thinking again, how much does landfills, from our refuse and getting it right, the plastics and everything else, affect climate change?
Great question. I understand that New South Wales have actually just implemented some new laws around waste, especially food waste at landfill, and all those councils are now having to implement that across New South Wales. So really welcome the thoughts around waste and the impact, and maybe even if we want to extend that out into wastewater as well. Wastewater has a impact in the sense.
Yeah, absolutely. One quite surprising thing for the Hutt Valley, the single biggest source of emissions, as far as the council is concerned, is the Silver Stream tub. And that's because of methane emissions, and as James pointed out, it's a very potent greenhouse gas with a very large warming potential. So anything that can be done to reduce those methane emissions will have an immediate impact, because as he also pointed out, the lifetime of atmospheric methane against chemical attack, it's removed from the atmosphere by a free radical, is only about 12 years. So you can have an immediate impact, and one of them, very definitely, is food scraps. And I think there are now 3 or 4 councils in New Zealand. New Plymouth is one of them. I'm not sure the others, but Lower Hutt isn't one. Upper Hutt isn't one. That would make an immediate difference, and of course they are readily composted. So it's probably worth the councils here looking at how New Plymouth is doing this.
David, just to clarify, a scheme for food waste?
Yeah, just food on its own is a major, once it's buried, because methane is produced by anaerobic processes. Once it's buried, you generate huge amounts of methane. So that's really worth looking at. The wastewater question, I can't really comment on that. What does that have to do with greenhouse gas emissions? I mean, it's horrible.
Any other panels?
Yeah, that's a very nice question, and it reminds me that, again, a bit of a mark against our clean green image. I think that per head of population, people in this country throw away about twice as much stuff as your typical OECD member country citizen. So we generate an awful lot of waste considering the size of our population, and anything we can do to reduce that is good. And certainly around food waste or compostable waste, if you're able to do your own composting or contribute to some kind of community composting scheme, that's great, or whether the council gets involved and it's a whole community-wide thing, whatever works. And then after that, other waste, just reducing the amount of waste that you generate any way you can. Again, it gets back to that thing about how it's kind of hard to do these things these days. You go to the supermarket, you want to buy a cucumber and it's covered in plastic. I mean, how irritating is that? You just not buy them. You tell the people at the shop, hey, I want one that isn't wrapped in plastic, and eventually maybe they're not, but you still kind of have to go the flow to a certain extent. But just thinking about, again, making a conscious choice. Well, maybe I'll go to the farmer's market if there is one, and I'll be able to buy fruit and vegetables that haven't been wrapped in plastic. All sorts of ways we can use our spending power to shift things. I want to see all the changes happen immediately because we need to move fast. But again, we can make choices about how we live our lives and how we spend our dollars that will shift things in the right direction.
And Sophie, as a councillor in Kapiti Coast, what's been your experience and what do you think some of the challenges are there in the city?
It's definitely a really kind of valid question and a really important one too, one that sometimes is kind of a little bit left off the radar, I feel like, because we kind of think of, carbon emissions, and especially in a council environment, our transport emissions, as I mentioned, both kind of at a district-wide level, but also within our organisation, are emissions which are currently the biggest. But that wastewater question is a very real one. So through processing wastewater and sludge water, drying sludge from our district. That takes a whole lot of energy and it's quite the process. And as populations, especially in Kapiti, continue to grow, we're expecting 32,000 people to move into the district in the next 30 years, which links back to the intensification conversation. These people are going to need places to live and live in ways which enable them to live sustainable, low carbon lives. But it also means that there's a whole lot more pressure on our landfills, that there's a whole lot more pressure on our systems and processes which dry and process sludge, wastewater. And it means that we're going to have to be pretty innovative about how we do those things as a council. One of the things we're looking at currently is actually getting into the industry of solar and wind. So how can council use some of its land or land in partnership to actually establish solar, use it to power council operations, and everything within our organisation, but then also use it to support the community in reducing their own emissions too. Those are some of the things we're looking at. There are some awesome community initiatives which are up and running. In Paikakariki, we've got this thing called Pi Cycle, an awesome group of people who, if you sign up or subscribe to this organisation or kind of coalition type of thing, you pay a subscription and you can have your organic waste or your food waste collected from outside of your house once a week. It's then taken by bike to our community garden where it's then processed, made into compost and used to make, or to grow I should say, kai for the community and used to create this awesome space that we have down the end of the village, which is our community garden. So there are some really kind of interesting ways that I think we can look at the solutions in the space of waste and space in general in terms of addressing climate change, and both at a council level, kind of an organisational level, which a lot of people are quite far removed from, and it's kind of been interesting getting up with the play as to everything that's happening and then figuring out how I can influence that, and then also at a community level and supporting that as being someone who's now on the council. So yeah, it's a very, very valid question and something that I think is sometimes overlooked. We know that landfills have kind of a negative environmental impact because you're literally burying rubbish, which is kind of can't be good. But then also there's that kind of emissions impact as well, which has been mentioned. So yeah, but very good question. Thank you.
I remember when I lived in Auckland, and I used to look at a lot of community groups looking at ecological restorations of streams and rivers, and there was this very polluted, or what we thought was a very polluted stream in Newmarket, sort of captured Ringer Road and whole areas, and we found out that there were fish living in there. And so I said to the residents, well, now you're responsible for those fish. And they were absolutely shocked. I said, if you do anything that'll hurt this river, you might hurt them. And just recently I've got a worm bin, and I feel really accountable now to the worms. So I highly recommend getting some worms. You won't name them all because there's so many of them. But I now feel like I have to feed them. It's like part of the cycle, and it's quite nice to bring nature to you. And they certainly don't stink. It's so easy to maintain. And the plants at home just absolutely love it. We just put some soil on one of our plants and just took off. We think it's just this amazing energy that's not going into landfill, turning into methane. It's energy that we can put back into our garden at home. So I highly recommend getting some worms. We've got a few more questions at the back here.
Kia ora. My name is Louise. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that in the 12th century, 13th century, Genghis Khan ran amok upon the globe, killed about 40 million people, and caused about 1.5 degrees of climate cooling. He levelled all the villages, and because anybody who didn't want to accept him as ruler, he just totaled the lot. Let's get rid of the lot. And then it all went back to forest, and the climate came down by 1.5 degrees. So you could try something like that.
Just to be clear, the question is, do we have a Genghis Khan?
At the moment, and Ukraine's trying to.
So there's population.
I nominate
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So I mean, we have had China who put a population birth rate issue to try and manage the population. Is that something that we should be considering about population control on the planet?
Well, there's no doubt about it. The more humans you have,
Yeah,
the
well,
more resources.
Sorry, can I just...
What is the question?
The question is, we have a problem. The government or whoever does these, who does these climate, what do they call it? Questionnaires online, when you go and find out what your carbon footprint is. They seem to say you can plant a tree to offset your carbon emissions. Now, I realised when I did this, the vast thing, like you, was the transport emissions were the total problem. So it said plant trees, but I know that trees catch fire, which is a problem for the carbon sink farms where they catch fire. I know that trees actually absorb as much carbon as they produce over their total lifespan when they go back to the land. So it's really difficult to see how we can influence things by having a carbon farm of trees to offset it. And I want to know how you managed to get, David, your emissions down to 7, and why 7? What made the 7 up?
Okay, I hope I understand the question. So trees, very definitely the planet at the moment has got a fraction of the forest that it used to have on it. If you removed all of the arable land that we now have and planted trees, you would very definitely sink initially large amounts of carbon. But going back to what my wife and I managed to do, so the number one contributor was those 2 vehicles, the petrol-powered vehicles, and the fact that my wife was driving in and out several times a week to see her aged mother in Petone. So that really added to our emissions bill, as it were. We reduced that by moving to Petone and just having one vehicle, which is electric, not using that very much because you could have an argument that we've already got too many vehicles in the country. And using electric bikes and walking and using transport, which sadly Sophie is not free, but might be. That had a big impact, but then the other huge impact was changing what we eat. Very definitely beef, because beef animals, sheep, cattle, and venison, deer, are all ruminants, so they produce methane. So if you can get away from those meats, so-called red meats, and eat mostly chicken or pork, right there, just that single action will reduce your carbon emissions in the way of methane emissions. So that had a big impact on our emissions. Other things were quite minor. I mean, recycling plastic doesn't do very much, but what James talked about, reducing landfill, you can really do a lot there. You think of the embedded energy in carbon emissions when you throw out a piece of whiteware, steel. That's huge. Should try and avoid doing things like that. Buy things that last for a long time. So I hope that answers your question. It brought us from 15 down to 7, and we think we're now closer to 5, the world average.
Is there anything else that Ben wants to mention about in terms of behaviours for people and what they can do? I think it's been covered off quite well by Dave. Anything else?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can say anything that I haven't already said, but I do think it's a good exercise to go through, to go on to a carbon calculator and work out what your emissions are. Maybe, I haven't used the Auckland Council one, but maybe try at least 2 and see to get different answers, because they're not all equal. And then just, look at any way you can to reduce basically your use of energy, which can involve buying stuff. Stuff takes energy to produce, and we all have a lot more stuff now than we used to when I was a kid, I think. Just be thoughtful about how you use things and what things you have and how you travel around. All of those things can make a contribution. And I didn't quite hear all of what you said, but you mentioned something about the climate cooling down by 1.5 degrees. It made me think of a few things that have happened in the past that have had a cooling effect. For instance, the invasion of South America and the number of native South Americans that were killed by the European invaders, that led to a sort of rewilding of big parts of South America. A lot of trees grew, and that is thought to have contributed actually to the Little Ice Age. It reduced carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere a bit, and that led to a cooling of the planet for a while. So those kind of things, that there can be, I guess, political interventions that can lead to a cooler climate. And a volcanic eruption, a big volcanic eruption, will cool the climate by maybe 0.5 degree or 1 degree. I know Mount Pinatubo that erupted in 1991 in the tropics, and the sulfate cloud from that eruption got into the stratosphere and spread over the globe and cut down the amount of sunlight falling on the Earth. And that did cool the Earth for about 0.5 degree for a couple of years. And one of the schemes that's being looked at, not one I support, but there are people thinking about whether we could essentially simulate a volcanic eruption like that continuously by injecting sulfates into the stratosphere to block out sunlight. That would cool the climate, absolutely. It wouldn't change a lot of other things. It wouldn't change the acidification of the ocean, and it would be, if we did get into doing that, it would be a terrible sort of dance with the devil kind of situation. Once you started doing that, you'd have to keep going forever. As soon as you stopped and that cloud cleared away, you'd get a massive increase in temperature overnight virtually, because if you're still emitting the carbon dioxide and so on, you'd pay the price eventually. And putting one load of rubbish in the air over here to fix the fact that you put another load of rubbish in the air over there just doesn't strike me as a very good way to go. But it's something that's being thought about. I hope it doesn't come to pass, because I don't think it's the right approach at all. But there are certainly ways that the climate could be cooled down over quite short periods of time, whether that's through accident or design, I suppose. But maybe there could be a series of big volcanic eruptions over the next 20 years that will cool the climate. And if that happened, I would like to think that it wouldn't take energy away from reducing emissions, because it would make it seem as though the climate change might have stopped for a while. But it's just, all of those things are just very short-term effects. And the long-term effect is always the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. If that's still going up, then we're digging ourselves a bigger and bigger hole into the future.
Listen, we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up, I think.
Following on from that,
Great. Thank you.
following on from that, has the pandemic reduced our carbon emissions?
Awesome question. Thank you very much.
Yep, so it's a very, very good question. You imagine international air travel shut down, a lot of industry shut down, you'd expect to see an effect. And yeah, the emissions in 2020 reduced by an estimated 7%. Did we see any halt in that terrible curve of increasing carbon dioxide appearing ahead? No. Although the emissions were reduced, you didn't see any change in atmospheric carbon dioxide that you could attribute to that. And then sadly, last year, the emissions went up again. So I don't know what to say. I mean, it's pretty upsetting.
Yes, so that's right. In 2020, the pandemic or lockdowns associated with the pandemic led to about a 7% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions globally, and those emissions have bounced back. But it's that thing that to stop the rise in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we have to not just reduce emissions by 7%, we have to reduce them by 100%. So the rate of rise of carbon dioxide in 2020 would have been a tiny bit less than it would have been otherwise, but yeah, it would be hard to detect, it could say. Yeah. So you could say that that's the kind of size of change we need every year until we get to zero from now. And we don't want to do it by having pandemics and lockdowns. We have to do it by finding better ways to generate energy and move ourselves around that don't just involve shutting everyone in their homes for several months of the year.
Right, thank you very much, everybody. What I'm going to do now is just ask the panel members to give us a little summary of what they think about the discussion today. Any things that have been top of mind, any key messages that you'd like to leave with this audience. So, would you like to say?
Yeah, I would say change is coming whether we like it or not, really. We're going to need to change, and if we make the most of this opportunity that we have, the change could look rather positive instead of it kind of being forced upon us and being as a result of impeding climate impacts, which just continue getting worse. So I would say that if we really harness these next few years and further the next decade to make the change that's needed both at an individual level and a systems level, through some of the learnings that we now have from the pandemic. We know how easy it is now to work from home a couple of days a week, to then also have breaks in our workday, to head out on the beach and spend time with our families and connect with nature. There are so many people and places, I think, that we can take learnings from. Those in the Pacific who are on the front lines now, who have the reality in their hearts and on their minds about the impacts of climate change. We need to take those learnings, we need to take them into the future, but start creating that future that we want right now, because we can't wait for someone else to kind of take control of that or to show us the way. I think, yes, we need system change and we need that now too, but we have to start kind of being that change, and there have been some great ways that I think that have been mentioned that we can start acting upon and really carry that forward. So yeah, I would say there's so many takeaways, and I hope that all of you in the audience have at least a few things that you're taking away from this conversation with, and hopefully a feeling of optimism and a way forward as to how to communicate this with your friends, with your whānau, with your colleagues, so that we can keep kind of growing this collective and growing the amount of people in Aotearoa who really care about the planet and who care about the next generation and who want to be a part of the change that's needed. So yeah, that's my little summary.
Absolutely, and I guess to add on, to follow on, I just wanted to reiterate that we have all the power. We know the climate's changing. We started off with this. We know the climate's changing. We know it's human activity. We know that it's us adding the greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Most of that's coming through burning fossil fuels. So we have 100% of the power in the situation. We're the ones doing this to ourselves. So we have all the power to stop doing that, to stop burning fossil fuels mostly, and to stop super intensive agriculture and land use changes that aren't helpful. So it's over to us to take that power and use it. And we will always have 100% of the power. One thing I didn't say before that I think is useful to reiterate, we talk about getting to 50% reduction by 2030 and so on. And I've talked to some groups who've said, well, if we don't achieve that, then climate change goes out of control and we're all going to die. There'll be some sort of apocalypse. Actually, no, that is not true. If we don't achieve those goals, then we get more climate change than we would have otherwise. And it becomes harder and more expensive, and more people have to be displaced and more people get hurt. But the climate will never go into a runaway mode. We will always have the power to stop emitting greenhouse gases. However warm it gets, however ugly it gets, we could still, if there'd been 5 degrees of warming and then we decide, we're going to stop burning fossil fuels, that would stop climate change at that point. We don't want to get to that point, believe me. The sooner we can take action, the better. So, if we can get to zero emissions by 2040, brilliant. That means we'll have even less future warming. But we're always going to have the power to stop this problem from getting worse. And it's just a question of actually using that power. So let's get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. James. Couldn't agree more. My takeaways from this meeting, what a wonderful bunch of questions. It really, really makes me feel better. I've been through a lot of dark times following that growth, that horrible growth of carbon dioxide over the decades. But, okay, I have a mix of optimism and pessimism, but I'm very optimistic when I see other countries, the tools that are out there, the young people, like Sophie. Look at Copenhagen. Copenhagen, the city of Copenhagen will be net zero carbon in 2 years. How have they done that? One of the things is there are far more bicycles in Copenhagen than there are cars. So as this thing is doable, you've heard some of our ideas, the techniques, the things that we can all do as individuals. And as James said, we need to get out there and talk about it. Education is so important. One of the demands for school strikes for climate, they're contingent, I was there on the steps of Parliament this time last year, was climate education in schools. Why aren't we doing that? We all need to know more about this problem to be able to face it. And we will face it and we will succeed. Thank you.
There was a 23-year-old man who was standing on a point gathering CO2 emissions. And David, what you did at that age is why we're here now. And I feel so privileged that the people we have on the stage here have led so much of an influence, both internationally and also domestically as well, with the amazing work that you've been doing, both of you too as well. And so it is an absolute great pleasure that we've had you on stage here today. Now, Upper Hutt City Council has been an absolute privilege for us to be able to support this event in partnership with Whirinaki. I just want to acknowledge our team that's been helping us here today. With Georgie, who's been running the mic, and also Mike, who's up the top there, who's been recording it today. The intention is to put this online so that we can inform and help educate more people, both in New Zealand and around the world. And the speakers we've had today and your questions have been absolutely amazing. So thank you very much, everybody. Upper Hutt City Council started its journey with adopting a sustainability strategy in August of 2 years ago. And it's made commitments of 8 major goals. One of them is around leadership, and that's why we're putting on this event today, is because we want to get our leaders in climate change out there to the world. We also have made our own commitments to be a carbon neutral, net carbon neutral council by 2035. And in the last year, our officer here, Kylie Robinson, has been working with the elected members and our council to identify, first of all, what is our emissions profile? And I would encourage, if you're part of an organisation, to try and find out what that is. And then also, what are the practical things you can actually do? And the council, in its long-term plan, has agreed to refurbish the pool. And the pool, which is our one of our biggest emitters, represents 16% of the council's emission because of the gas, is planned to be turned off. And that is a major transformation, and you'll find that cities all across Wellington are doing that as part of their long-term plan. And also the council launched a grant which closed only on Monday, and that is to help organisations across Upper Hutt try and deliver on those sustainability goals. So far the council's committed $100,000 to help support groups or organisations going through change. And on Monday, and I don't think even the mayor and the council know this yet, we've been oversubscribed $400,000 worth of applications from organisations all across the city to want to help to improve its sustainable profile for the city. So as long as organisations are making massive leaps forward, I think there is good opportunity for change going forward. So I'll welcome the mayor onto the stage to give out a couple of books that we've got for the speakers today. And I just want to give a huge round of applause to our speakers. Councillor Sophie, thank you so much for all your energy, inspiration. Keep it going, we really appreciate it. So thank you so much, Councillor Sophie. Of course, our next guest speaker on the panel, thank you very much, Professor. Professor Jane, everybody. And thank you for your tireless work, Dave. We really appreciate everything that you've done for New Zealand and for around the world. Well, thanks for coming along, everybody. And if you haven't had a chance to look at the exhibition, please do head downstairs and have a look at it. It's really worthwhile. Thank you, everybody. Cheers.